cover a lot of ground. Oftentimes these workshops will be a couple of days, and so what we're doing is just a broad overview, and we're not really going to get into bugs and mold, although if left unchecked, those can become disasters as well. When we train at this library, we train with water emergencies, and so today we're going to do a PowerPoint for about the first hour, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to go review some of the resources that I introduced, and then we'll take another break and get set up for hands-on exercise. So we'll do a little bit of salvage because that's the most fun. And dealing with wet materials, our focus is always that, because even if you have a fire, which is pretty much as bad as it gets, you have to deal with the water first, because when you have response to a fire, everything gets wet, whether it's sprinklers or whether it's fire hoses, whatnot. It's all going to get wet. You deal with that first, and then you deal with the fire. But because this library has had a massive flash flood in the past that took out the first floor of the library, we've had roof leaks. We were hoping that that wouldn't start dripping today. We have had mechanical system failures. So there are so many different reasons that you might respond to a collection emergency with water. So I think it's on everybody's mind now that we're seeing so much disasters here and on the mainland that are just sweeping through. And so these are all ones that have hit Hawaii, and collections have been impacted severely. So going back to '92, I'm dating myself, I've responded to all of these disasters either in immediate response or recovery. So Hurricane Iniki, I was working for the State Foundation of Culture, the Arts at the time, and we had just changed all the artwork on the island of Kauai, and then the hurricane hit, and we had to wait until we could get over to the island and do recovery, and there about 30% of the phone poles went down on the island. So it's really dramatic to be there in the aftermath of that. The center photograph is the basement of this library. And I wasn't here for the flood, but I was brought in later to continue the flood recovery work, which lasted 10 years. So that's something that's important to keep in mind, is the difference between an emergency and a disaster. We use the terms interchangeably, but an emergency is something that requires an immediate response. And if left unchecked, it can become a disaster, whereas a disaster is something that has evolved into a disaster, or it was a catastrophic event like these that we're showing on the screen. So Heukelem Palace in Kona, they had an earthquake in 2006. They had a lot of damage for that. And then several years later, after they had just finished recovering and getting their building all back together, there was the Japan tsunami, which flooded the basement of their building where they had some collections stored. And this library partnered with them on the FEMA recovery for that. So we brought in conservators and cultural practitioners to partner on the recovery of those. So that was a really tragic event, but important recovery efforts for the kapa and kahili and some of the papers that was done here. So it's a terrible photo, but I had to include this because this is what can happen to books when they get wet. So they swell up so much that they can actually be really difficult to remove from the shelf because they just expanded into an arc. And I soaked some materials overnight in a garbage bucket, and as I had hoped, they're like fully packed in there now. So we'll have fun getting them out later. These are just some of the minimal things that you need in a plan. You can have a small plan or you can have a big plan, but you always need a call list. And the call list is going to have your administration, your whoever handles your collections and your financial information, whoever's going to do PR on behalf of your institution. So at small institutions, the loan arrangers, you're going to have to be doing it all. But if you have a board, you're going to have your board members on there. You're going to need, beyond your institutional contacts, you're going to want contacts with conservators, your plumber, your electrician, all those people you're going to call in the event of an emergency. You want to spell out what are your immediate response actions, because in a disaster, your brain goes into fight or flight, and you're only operating on a small percentage of your normal capacity. And so it's really great to have people to connect with that are not part of your institution for advice, because when your collections are involved, it gets very personal, and it's good to have somebody who's not so invested with that particular collection to be able to help you think it through for the response. Collections priorities are something that's really best if you can spell that out in advance, so that you know if you have a catastrophic event and you're not going to be able to save everything, what are you going to save first? And so we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that would be your loans. It would be your most financially valuable materials. It would be your most sensitive, things that you're going to lose first if you don't treat them first. So you're going to need to determine in advance so that you're not wasting time trying to think through when you're in crisis mode. What are your collection priorities? So this is something you can do in advance. And then if certain parts of the collections aren't affected, then great, you don't have to deal with that part, but you just go down the list. Supplies inventory, you want to know where your stuff is so that you can respond. And the supplies that we have are really basic stuff that you mostly get at hardware stores. So everybody can do this, whether it be a big kit or whether it's just like a small plastic bin for a small institution. Salvage, you want to have some written guidelines for how you're going to respond to each of the different material types. And you're going to want to have your building floor plans, because if it's a really big disaster, chances are the first responders aren't going to let you back in. And if you have things that you know are really in trouble, and you have a floor plan and you can tell them, can you just go get this stuff, because this is the most important stuff in the building, you can work with them. And that's a conversation that's good to have also if you invite your fire department in once a year to just walk the building, so that they know what your most important things are and where they're at. So some of my favorite tools, the Pocket Response Plan. This is something that the Council of State Archivists developed back in 2006. And it really is the size of a credit card. And if you do nothing else, this is the first thing you should do. And it's a great outline for building on a plan. And it's a great thing that if you're a loan arranger, that you can have this one thing that you carry with you. I have one in my purse that I carry all the time, so even if I'm on the mainland, I have my call list. I can get in touch with people. I have one in my car. And then there's always some in the building, and the disaster kits as well. So we're going to talk about that, and that's one of the templates that should have been emailed out to everybody. Is there anybody using this already? Yeah. The Field Guide to Emergency Response, that's a recommended resource. It's a great outline that has some template forms in it that you can just fill in. And then the wheel, the emergency response and salvage wheel is something I highly recommend that you get. It's a quick reference for what you can freeze, why would you want to freeze? So freezing buys you time. So whenever possible in a large event, you're going to want to freeze things. Paper can all go in the freezer. So this will help you with that quick decision making by material types, and I brought some so you'll be able to play with them later. You can get the field guide and the wheel from the American Institute for Conservation. They're pretty reasonable. I think the field guide is $25 and the wheel is, I think, $10. I've just checked on the field guide this week and it has been updated, and so it no longer comes with the DVD, but those are all online now. And so you can just go to the American Institute for Conservation website and watch all the videos, and I really recommend that because they will cover all different types of materials. Because this is for the archivist group, we're focused on materials that you're most commonly going to find in the archives today, but this will have much broader. So some of my favorite tools, the Honolulu app, that is Honolulu Emergency Management, so that'll prompt you whenever there's an emergency alerts in town. So if you haven't signed up for that, I recommend you do. That'll give you a heads up on emergencies, maybe before they show up on the news. Time to fill up your gas tank. Stock up on supplies before you're stuck in long lines. The Emergency Response and Salvage app is an app that you can download for your phone that is like the Emergency Response and Salvage wheel, but we don't all carry that around with us. We have it in our kit, but then you can have that with you just like the pocket plan. The last item, I mentioned already the Field Guide to Emergency Response videos. Both the ERS and the Field Guide are available on the American Institute for Conservation website. The SAA, that's the Society of American Archivists, they had the Regional Archival Association Consortium. I was on that committee a few years ago, and we developed a list of disaster response resources, including a list of recovery vendors. So I encourage you to go to that and look at what are some of the vendors that you might need that are specific to your materials. So there's some like microfilm that are very specific, that's the very first thing you need to take care of in an emergency, because you got like 48 hours to get it to a vendor and there's no longer one on island. So that's a problem. And then there's some magnetic media recovery and different vendors for really specialized things in obsolete formats. So this is our disaster kit at the library. We have a couple stashed around the place. It's very simple, stuff you can get at a hardware store. We always have the giant roll of plastic because we get a lot of roof leaks. And we do canopies for those. Always buckets to catch the water. Lots of real basic stuff, and I have a list of this that I can send out to you folks. But I wanted to show you it doesn't have to be complicated. We like ours on wheels because we're a big institution, and that way we can just grab the kit and roll it to the site and start deploying. So training, one of the things you want to include with your plan is you should, depending on the size of your institution, you may just have a collection emergency response team. If you have a lot of collection people, it would include them and maybe a building manager or security. So training is really important, and one of the things that we encourage is adopting the incident command system, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But it is something that was developed by emergency responders, and it's a flexible system, and it's what the emergency responders are using, and so you're able to better communicate with them in a controlled way so that it's not so chaotic. The tabletop exercise is something where you build a scenario, you get your team together, and it's a non-threatening environment, and you just walk through it. And you pull out your plan and see, is this scenario addressed? Are we adequately prepared to respond? See, here we did one for Sinclair Library. Okay, we had a roof leak this weekend, and so we didn't tell the team what was coming. You just create the scenario and then you present it, so that they have to think on the fly. Okay, who are we going to call first? Do we need to bring in a conservator? Do we need freezers? So you just walk through what happened with this major roof leak, and it went down to the basement and stuff got flooded down there, and so you just create something so that people can think it through when they're not panicked and see whether they think it's going to work. And this builds confidence in being able to respond just by going through the process of thinking it through. And then hands-on, which we're going to do a little bit of today, but it's really good to be able to respond to materials that have already been damaged. We always just gather up some discarded materials or junk mail from my house, you'll see. Get it wet and work with recovery of it. And the materials change when you get them wet, and so being able to experience what that's like. Some of the paper, if you leave it long enough, is going to be incredibly difficult to deal with without just tearing it apart. And so it's good to play with stuff that you don't have to worry if you tear it in half. We're just going to throw it away at the end of the day anyway, but it's good to know. Whoops. Be careful with that micro spatula. It'll just skewer right through the wet paper and things like that. You want to experience what that's like. So the incident command system was something that developed after the 1960s wildfires, and they had a lot of people to respond, and they all had their different lingo. They couldn't communicate together, and people, unfortunately, they had a major disaster and people died. And so it led to a more national approach to setting a chain of command structure. There's responsibility assigned, and whoever responds first is in charge until the person of a higher rank shows up and takes over. And so it just allows you to be able to respond in an organized fashion. And if cultural institutions adopt this, we then have a representative for the institution dealing with the head of the fire group when they show up, and the head of the police when they show up, and the head of campus security. And that you don't have everybody running out there and trying to tell them what happened, because that doesn't help them. So you use common language, which is funny because, you know, they all refer to it as ICS, but if you're hearing it for the first time, it's an acronym, and we're not supposed to be using acronyms, but I threw it up there because it's something you will see if you're studying some disaster response stuff. If you want to dig deep, there's the FEMA online course where you can go through that. But the one that I really recommend is Connecting to Collections Care. If you're not familiar with them, it's something that is now being programmed by the American Institute for Conservation. They have just an incredible archive of free webinars, and they'll post the resources that go with the webinars. And one of the ones that's really good is this ICS for cultural repositories. And so it shows you why would we want to adopt this and use it for our institutions. So if you have time, it's a good hour and a half spent. So I just threw this in because I love this so much. You got to be practical. This is Auntie Fanny Ahoy over at Hulehe Palace responding to the tsunami that took out their basement. And it's just, you get down and dirty and you just do what needs to be done. And they got out the tables and the hoses and they started cleaning off the stuff that they could just clean off, and the volunteers are keeping track of things with the inventory. That's one of the concerns. Sometimes numbers will float off if you have artifacts. With papers, you might have things in folders. You can throw away the folder, but you need to keep that information because context is everything. And so it's just getting practical, and there's nothing fancy about it. You just dive in and get the resources you need and start chipping away at it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about, I figured all archives have books, and we have some librarians here as well. So we're going to do some response for books and pamphlets and some loose papers. I have just a couple of photographs, and I didn't bring any magnetic tape. But some of the things that are particularly problematic are coated paper, and that's your glossy paper. So if you have a lot of art books, those color plates are going to be usually coated paper. Any magazines, things like that. Any photo, you know, if you have coffee table books, all those glossy pages are a real problem, because if you don't deal with them right away, they're going to dry and your book is going to turn into a brick. And so for those, you have to either freeze them immediately, which is the best if you have that option, or you're going to have to interleave every single page to keep them from sticking together. Encapsulated materials, that's another really problematic. People thought that encapsulation, it's great for handling, but it actually does allow some moisture to pass through the plastic. And so one thing is, if it's encapsulated very tightly, when paper gets wet, it expands. And so it'll cause it to expand within the plastic that's not expanding. And so you'll have all this cockling or wrinkling all in there because it's bunching up, constrained. The other thing is, it's just not going to dry, and so you're going to grow mold. So encapsulated materials you need to deal with right away. You need to just get a scissors, cut a couple sides, pull it open, and deal with the paper. Throw that away unless it has the information about it, and then you want to make sure you keep that little corner of call number or session number with your material. Microfilm, I already mentioned that you've got a really short amount of time. You need to know whether it's Kodak or Fujifilm. They deal with their own film and nothing else, and so you have to segregate it and ship it to their recovery location. So it's one of the problem areas. So I couldn't do this without talking about our flood. It's been 14 years now. I wasn't working here at the time, but I was very much aware of it. Yeah.
I just have a question about you said that you can have it shipped there. Do you have to have like an agreement with them, or anyone can just like ship?
Oh, you have to contact them. And so that's one of the vendors that's on that Regional Association Archival Consortium. There's a link to their website and how you make contact with them. So ideally, if you have microfilm in your collection, you're going to have, most places are going to have more than one kind. You would include the contact information on your little pocket plan for Kodak and for Fuji if you have both, or one or the other if you only have one type. And that way you know to call them, hey, we just had a disaster, we need to do a shipment. And so having all that information on your plan in advance, you're not just wasting time because you don't have a lot of time. And so if microfilm are really critical to your collection, that's something you want to be prepared to deal with. So you don't, for microfilm, you don't need to have a contract in place, but you need to know who to call and set that up in a hurry. So this is our flash flood. That's the basement of the library. On the left is going out to the side here, and on your right is the map room. And that's where the focus really was for this library, was maps and aerial photographs. The government documents were down there as well. So there were some books recovered, but a lot of the books could be replaced. And so it was a matter of focusing on the unique materials. And so that's where prioritizing your collections really comes in. And what they did even beyond that was they decided, okay, all the non-Hawaii stuff, we're just going to send out to Balfour, which is a major, one of the big global disaster recovery companies. And so they froze and shipped out all the wet material that wasn't Hawaii related. And then the Hawaii stuff they kept here and brought conservators in to treat it. And so we kept the Hawaiian Pacific maps and the aerial photos for the Pacific and Hawaii. So, you know, this may look kind of terrifying to have your gigantic photographs just shrunk from trees, but that's the reality of it. You have to do what you can. You only have 24 to 72 hours before mold sets in when things are soaked, and when you're in our climate year-round, we have conditions that are conducive to mold growth. So they literally went out there with hoses, strung things from trees. Other things went to freezers that were around campus. So we had something that we affectionately called the fish maps, and that they weren't anything to do with fishing, or it was because they were in one of the freezers at one of the natural sciences, and they came back smelling like fish. On the right is a smaller problem. You have these little pieces of film, and you can see they all have tags with them because you can't lose track of what those things are and why you have them. Without the information, it would be impossible to track down the source. So what they did here was, rather than trying to take the maps out of the drawers, the maps had been submerged in 6 to 8 feet of muddy water from the Manoa stream that flooded the basement. And so they're incredibly heavy, and they just took the entire map drawers out with all the maps in them and loaded them into freezer containers. And the freezing buys you time because it stops the chance of the mold growth. And then instead of dealing with tens or hundreds of thousands of maps at once, you can take out one drawer at a time and start to deal with them that way. So this is what they looked like when I started working here. I was hired first as a casual hire to do recovery of the maps and the aerial photographs. And so we had some in our walk-in freezer here, but we also had a portable freezer container parked out on the lawn for almost 10 years. And there were 2 of them at first, and then down to 1 as we slowly brought things up. So we would go out there with a cart, open up the freezer, grab one of these drawers and bring it up here, wait for it to start just thawing, and then start washing them. Unfortunately, the cabinets could not be saved. They said no matter how much cleaning they did, they could never get that mud off of it. It kept coming off. So they eventually ended up replacing them all. So this is what it looked like in the preservation department. They have this huge stainless steel sink, and the oversized materials were washed on a slant board. So you could just sheet away the mud, and they put a screen so they didn't block this back up the sink too badly. But this is some of the response that happened over a 10-year period. This is some of the first conservators. On the left is Kirk Lively from Balfour. they worked with the library and the conservators that were brought to Honolulu to do the response. On the right is Mary Woodley in the red. She was the head of conservation of Bishop Museum way back in the day. And Lynn Davis, the preservation head, called her to come out and respond to the flood because they had a relationship going way back. And so that was one of those key people that knew what to do, that wasn't emotionally invested in the response. So she was one of the first people Lynn called. And so they set up this protocol for how to treat things. Kirk Lively then went back and took that and had conservators train their staff at the Balfour facility in Fort Worth, Texas. So they treated the non-Hawaii stuff, and then the Hawaii materials were treated here. One of the surprising things that happened was fire insurance maps. These are really fabulous. I know State Archives has some. They are an incredible resource for looking at what towns look like at a point in time. But sometimes, instead of issuing new maps, because it's very expensive to do, they would send you pieces to paste over. This is the update. This building was torn down. It's now this. And so the repositories, or whoever had flood or fire insurance maps, would have to do these updates that would be applied in layers onto the original map. But when you put it in water, they all floated off. And so that was a huge project, and I believe they consulted with the State Archives because they had matching maps, and they then did them in layers in Mylar. So it's kind of, we don't want to say a happy accident, but it's kind of fun to be able to flip through the layers and look at what it was originally, and then subsequently the buildings were replaced. And so rather than just gluing them all back down, which they could have done, they chose to approach it that way. So you never quite know what's going to happen when you get them wet. So this is, again, the preservation department, the operation set up for dealing with maps, which are really difficult, oversized materials, get very fragile sometimes. A lot of the papers were varied widely. Sometimes you have colors that would run. Sometimes you have thicker or thinner papers. The quality of the maps, depending where they came from, would respond differently in water. On the right, you see documents being, after they've been washed, being put onto a press. And so I should explain this a little bit more. The washing, they would wash it on the slant board in the sink, and then there was this baker's rack that was customized with screens for drying, and they put it in between two pieces of rime, which is a spun-bound polyester. It's inert, and it's a mesh so that your material can dry in between, and your material is not going to get stuck to it. So they would go on the rack for a while to drip dry for about a half hour before being loaded into the press, because you don't want to put everything in there soaking wet and leave it overnight. So what we would do is allow it to dry for a half hour, load it on the press, leave it overnight, come back the next morning and switch out all the blotter paper again, and so that you get it extra dry. So it was always a couple-day process to get everything washed and dried. Same thing with the small documents, but you could fit a whole bunch of them onto one sheet of the blotter paper. And that's what the press looks like fully loaded. My predecessor was an engineering major, and so he came up with all kinds of great MacGyver fixes. And so it was corrugated cardboard, and they just used the cardboard that came with the blotter paper and cut it to the same size as the blotter paper on a press board, and layer cardboard, blotter is super absorbent cotton paper, and then the rime and the map and the rime and the blotter and the cardboard, and repeat those in sandwiches. And we can get 25 of them onto one. So the most we ever did in a day would be like 50 maps in a day. That was unusual because we could get 25 onto one.
Well, how come, you said a remake and then blotter paper?
Yeah.
You never put anything against blotter paper directly?
It might stick. And so the remake is something that shouldn't stick.
Yeah.
But the blotter paper, you know,
It
if
will
your
still
mat
absorb
is
food.
wet enough, you know, the paper fibers can bond together and you don't want to have to try to figure out how to get it off of there and create a secondary issue. This funny shroud thing, in case you were wondering, is a big tornado fan, and we would hook up the fans, and this is an early picture because by the time I was doing it, we turned the fan around so that it was pulling the air through. So because we had the cardboard, the corrugated cardboard would allow the air to be pulled through, and so you're drying between the layers to expedite the drying process. And the discard boxes on the top are just extra weight to keep everything nice and flat because your paper likes to move once it gets wet. And I think I've got some good examples in that garbage can back there. And the clamps just to hold it all together. So very, you know, your basic hardware materials. Except for the shroud, which I think Kyle's mom sewed. Thawing and rinsing the photographs. So I'm going to go through a whole series of pictures on response to photographs. So the aerial photographs, one thing that was learned from this response is that the photos should have been done before the maps. Because the longer they stayed in the freezer, the worse the outcome. Whereas paper, it didn't matter whether you left it in there 10 years, it was still pretty much the same damage. So that was a sad thing. So the ones that they treated early on, they had pretty good results, but some of the ones that sat in there for years didn't come out good, and you can see they were a mess. And so keeping track of that information from the folder, you throw away the folder, but you need to make sure you keep that information with the photos as they're going through all these different processes. So Kyle in the middle there is peeling apart the folders as they're defrosting. You can see a little blow dryer, a hair blow dryer that we wouldn't put it on the heat setting, but just to start to get the ice to melt so that we could separate folder by folder. And we didn't want them to all thaw at once, because with these giant blocks of aerial photos, we couldn't get through them all in a day. So we would peel off what we could, put the rest back in the freezer. The ones that were stable enough would be rinsed. And so you'll see the series of trays of water. And so you start out and you might have a lot of mud in the first one, and they get progressively cleaner as you go. And then drying them. And window screens are a fabulous thing for drying, and these just went straight on the screens without any remake or anything, or they went on tables on some old newsprint that we used to be able to get. Harder to get these days, but you can see there's a lot of discoloration, there's a lot of curling. So all these things are just the reality, but the tags on the edge of the paper show you that we were keeping track of what each folder was as it went. And then flattening, so once the photos were totally dry, because you need to make sure they're totally dry, they act the same way as coated paper. If you allow photos to remain in contact with each other and dry, you'll never get them apart. So you have to make sure they're totally dry, and then we would put them in the folders under weight, at least overnight, check them, and then load them up into these and send them back down.
Well, I noticed your photographs were on tables drying. Do you not want to use the rack, the remake rack for photos? For any
We did
reason?
it all.
Oh, everything?
They take a lot of space.
Oh, okay. But did you just put
We had them all over the
on
counters in the lab. We had them on tables. We had them on racks.
everyone?
And so it depends how much you're doing at a time.
Got it.
If we were just doing a small batch, we would just leave them on the racks. But So that's something in disaster recovery, you want to think in advance that I am going to need a ton of flat surface area to do this response. And so that's part of your planning and training is, okay, if we have to deal with this, how much stuff can we actually treat in-house? How much are we going to call in a vendor? Do we need arrangements for reciprocal relationships with other institutions for off-site storage of stuff? I mean, there's just so many different things depending on your collection. How are you going to deal with this? So, moving away from the massive flood, but I just wanted to share that with you because it gave this library a lot of expertise working with all those conservators and developing some protocols for recovery. I know I'm going over, I'm going to speed it up a bit. So we have had a lot of roof leaks. We've had mechanical system leaks where the AC starts to rain on the stacks. You can see on the left is the roof leak, and it wasn't noticed until there was an interlibrary loan request. Somebody went to go pull a book and it was icky like this. It had been sitting for probably a week or two unchecked because it was just dripping right onto the top of the stacks and making its way down through both sides. So it was about 10 shelves affected. So emergency, it doesn't rise to the disaster definition, but this is how we responded. We went and got students from Access Services because they had the biggest pool of people, and I got the selectors for the books that were in that section and got them to come down and make some really quick decisions about what do we really need to save. So anything, that's an important thing to do is assess, do we need to save all of this? Because you don't want to put all this energy into saving stuff and then they say, oh, well, actually we didn't need this. And so if you can do that at the front end, that's the best. You can't in a major disaster, but for this we could. And so maybe, I don't know, a couple giant garbage bags of stuff, just they were able to discard the books, remove them from the system, and we didn't have to deal with this. And then we did air drying for the ones that were only damp, and that's what the students were helping with, was helping to sort the really wet books from those that were just damp. And so we chose to air dry on tables, the damp books, and the rest got boxed up and thrown in our freezer. And then we were able to just treat them box by box instead of all of the super wet books at once. This is what you'll usually see when there's a roof leak or a mechanical system leak coming from above, is that people get out the plastic and just drape it over the stacks. But it's not the best solution. It's a great start because you want to do whatever you can to keep your materials from getting wet. But what it does then, if you don't stop the leak, is that the water keeps coming down and you just keep mopping. And if you have carpet, the water's all over the floor. So a better solution, again, the great Kyle Hamada, we have a handout from him, developed this canopy. So all you need is a giant roll of plastic. You cut out the size that you need for the area of coverage that you need. And so ours are 20 feet wide, I believe, and 300 feet long. And so you just cut off, get it to cover the shape, and string it up, and we would put it right on this, which is not structurally sound, but because you're going to put roof drains in, and that plastic doesn't need to contain the water, it's only dripping it into a bucket, it doesn't have a lot of weight. And so that way you're able to just keep replacing the buckets instead of mopping the floor all the time. So air drying, books, you set them out on tables. You put something absorbed. We use blotter or newsprint. Absorb the water as it's draining out of the paper. Fan them out if they can. Start fans in the area so that you're drying circulating air. You don't want the fans blowing directly on the books, just circulating air in the space. That way they dry a little more evenly. Pamphlets, you would remove any plastic covers and string them up on a clothesline. If they're thin enough, they're just going to dry that way. So freezing, I've mentioned a couple times. This was a pretty good sized leak we had on the second floor. We dried about 1,000 books and pamphlets on tables that you saw on the prior slide. But the really wet books and the books that had coated paper, we started boxing them for the freezer. And these actually, because we had 63 boxes, it was enough that we sent them out to a disaster recovery vendor. So if you need to go that route, the boxes have to stay frozen, so they get palletized down by your freezer and shipped out in a freezer truck and sent to the mainland facilities for vacuum freeze drying. And vacuum freeze drying will remove the moisture, and if you pack them right, they should come back pretty good. So this is where some of the materials went from the library. These are probably maps or aerial photos that went to Texas and went in a vacuum freeze dry chamber. A lot of the vendors will offer thermal vacuum freeze drying. Thermal is heat. You don't want that. It's not good for papers. It does make it cheaper and faster, but you just want vacuum freeze drying. So dehumidifying, getting into the mold issue a little bit. This is what it looks like on a massive scale of trying to cover large areas that don't have power, park a giant generator outside of your building, and do it that way. We have a series of these 50-gallon buckets in the library with giant dehumidifiers that we unfortunately are always deployed because there's always a problem somewhere. The problem with them is that the good thing is they have a pump that'll pump the water into the barrel. The bad thing is you then have a 50-gallon barrel of water to go wrestle with and dump somewhere. So I know you guys are all doing this, but just need to mention electronic records. You want to have your 3 copies. You can have 2 on site. 1 can be in the cloud or sent somewhere else. You can have reciprocal relationships. We're all storing our collection records electronically, and that is a really big priority to protect that investment of time and effort that's gone into recording all your information. So that's just, we all know that those are no longer acceptable ways to store your backup data. Should be on a server or a couple of hard drives. And so we get into personal protective equipment. That's something, especially if you're dealing with mold and if you're coming into a building after a major water event, within a few days you're going to see mold. So you're going to want a respirator. If you haven't been respirator fit tested, you can get a disposable respirator from the hardware store, either an N95 or N100. It needs to have 2 straps or it's just a dust mask. So keep that in mind when you're shopping. I know I'm gone over, but the goggles, if you get goggles, especially for mold, you want to keep it from anything getting in your eyes. You get chemical splash goggles and not the kind that have the holes in the side. So the chemical splash goggles are completely enclosed, so the spores aren't going to get in. Protective clothing, you might even need a hard hat depending on what you're responding to. Mental health is something that you need to keep in check. In response to Hurricane Sandy, the National Heritage Responders, which is a group of volunteers with the American Institute for Conservation, they found that the people they were responding to who had had damaged collections, that was the part they weren't really prepared for. They knew how to treat the materials, but they couldn't treat the materials until they listened to everybody's stories. And so that's an unknown, thing that you go into. And that was real here. When in 2014, we did a commemorative flood exhibit where we showed what happened and what we went through. And we had people in the library that they really get PTSD. It was so strong that they didn't want to walk through that gallery. And so knowing what you're going through as a responder, as well as the people that you're working with, is something to keep in mind, and make sure you take breaks, sleep, eat lots of water. So WestPass, the Western States and Territories Preservation Assistance Service, this is something that evolved after the hurricanes in Louisiana and then the flood here a year later. The Western States head of preservation and research libraries got together and organized WestPass, because a lot of the resources are on the East Coast. And so they started doing these training workshops. And Lynn Davis, in the redhead there, was the champion of this training for Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. She would go out to Guam and American Samoa and Northern Marianas. And she hasn't been doing this much lately, but if she does, I really recommend it. It's a couple-day workshop usually. Something you should think about doing if you get a chance, because I don't know that they're going to be doing it much longer. So just to mention that, so I sort of have this liaison role with FEMA and the Heritage Emergency National Task Force. The head of that works for the Smithsonian and FEMA, and she's a Punahou School graduate. And so she keeps in touch with us and puts me in contact with FEMA people in advance of the most recent hurricanes, so that we can share information, and if we have an emergency, I can get it to them right away. Who do I know that needs help across our islands that's in a cultural institution? I also have a liaison relationship with the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency because of some training we went through several years back. And I'm a National Heritage Responder. So Lynn Davis and myself are the Hawaii reps for them. And so there's lots of National Heritage Responder members that are hoping to come out here one day to help us, but so far we've been good. We haven't needed their help. And then we have a Connecting to Collections Care listserv that was developed out of a grant. And so I know several of you are on that. If you're not receiving my occasional emails, I'll have a sign-up sheet at the end. I'll put out announcements for training opportunities, but also hurricane preparedness tips. It's the one that's usually the focus. One of the things FEMA really loves is that back in 2014, we worked with the Pacific Disaster Center and the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency to map all of the cultural institutions in our state. So we used the AHA directory of cultural repositories. We used the Hawaii Libraries and Hawaii Museums Association's online directories and made sure we had addresses for all those, so that when there's a disaster, I can let the first responders know whether cultural institutions might be impacted in that area. You need to prepare at home. Some of the great things that for you and your team, you should have a go bag, everything that you're in need if you need to evacuate, and you might have an Ohana plan, which there's a template you can just fill out, and it's phone numbers and who you're going to call on. If you don't take care of yourself and your family, you're not going to be able to respond to the disasters at work. So this is in the case of island-wide disasters. And that's it for now. I know I really went over, so it's time to go on a break, and I will get set up for the next portion. So if you can all be back in 10 minutes. The bathrooms are down the hall. There's a water fountain there,